Gabe, thank you for taking the time. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
All right, so I guess I better start off by explaining what on earth we're doing here because this is a little bit different, a little bit weird, and it's probably of interest to like 1% of people out there at most. So, so basically, what I've done is just to give people a bit of background in case they're tuning in cold. Is that one of my aims for this year is to spend a bit of time learning Italian. I actually did used to speak Italian a long time ago, but I only spent a few months doing it. And it was like over 15 years ago, so I've pretty much forgotten everything. It's morphed into Spanish since then. But one of the things I want to do this year,
too.
Yeah, it's funny how that happens, isn't it? So I want to get my Italian back, and I am kind of devising a project of some kind. And the reason I wanted to talk to you is because, as I think very few people will realize this, but I'm actually a huge opera fan, and obviously you with your background in languages and opera, I reached out to you a while back and said, hey, can we chat about Italian opera? And you very kindly agreed. So I've got no idea what we're going to talk about, really, where this is going to go, but I'm quite interested, and hopefully, if anyone out there is learning Italian and interested in opera, well, it's your lucky day. So, a couple of quick questions then. You have a long background in music, as I do. Although I think you probably treated it rather more seriously than I did. But tell me a little bit about your background with opera in particular, as it relates to these different languages. Like, what was it like?
Sure. I would say initially with singing, I did a touch of classical music. I started singing when I was 15. But for the most part, it was musical theater. I didn't really get into opera until college, when I was 18 or so. At that point, I began a degree at the University of Southern California in opera performance, or vocal performance, I think was the name of their degree. And I think my first actual opera was Second Armored Guard in Magic Flute.
Okay.
Real title role. But we had sort of a lot of changes in staff and things, and eventually we just got this amazing team of conductor and director in Ken Kazan and Brent McMunn, and they started bringing in all sorts of just awesome productions. And they fortunately liked me, and I had a good voice at the time for my age, and it's guys in opera are generally sought after.
Are you tenor or baritone?
I'm a baritone, a high baritone. I dallied as a tenor for a year and a half or so. That was a painful year and a half, but
yeah.
And tenors in particular, if you can pull off tenor, then there is plenty of work generally. I mean, as opera goes. I mean, there's not plenty of work in opera, period. But if you're a tenor, then you are in a good position to find some work. But regardless, I mean, the male to female ratio is in favor of men in opera, significantly. And so yeah, I started getting some really nice roles. I played Pandolf in Massenet's Cendrillon, the Cinderella story. There's a huge role for the father in that particular story, and that was my first real exposure to a decent amount of French. And so that was really great for really understanding the pronunciation system in that language. I didn't know French at the time, but I was getting weekly coaching specifically in the lyrics of my part. And when you're doing something that isn't just, I'm going to learn a single aria, but I'm going to learn an entire opera, there's a lot of French there.
Yeah, and you need to understand what you're singing as well, don't you? Obviously.
At the very least, yeah. I mean, I think that there's, there's sort of different levels of what you can bring to opera. I mean, the people who are just starting out, like those intro students, there's this book called 18 Songs and Arias, 18 Italian Songs and Arias, that basically everyone starts out with. And no one knows anything, you don't start out speaking Italian or knowing really anything of what you're saying in those books. Generally, they're just vocal exercises. And so you are, for the most part, saying gobbledygook in some language because you think it sounds good and your teacher thinks it's more better.
Okay, so a couple of practical questions at this point.
Sure.
So So I think you mentioned Italian and French operas so far.
Well, Magic Flute, I think we were. God, were we doing it in English? I would doubt that we were doing it in German. I think we were doing an English translation. I think that first one is an English
Okay.
translation.
How do you feel about English translations of operas?
They feel silly, but then again, operas are often really silly.
well, well, yeah. I mean, one of my favorite arias is Vesti la Giubba. The where they've got the scene with this big clown sitting there wearing makeup and bawling his eyes out down his face and smudging his makeup and stuff. So
Right.
yeah. So
But even in cases like that, like you're talking about arias where someone is like tearing their soul out, and like the lyrics support that.
yeah.
And so in those cases, like that's like, yes, there's a clown on the stage and stuff like that, but like there's a level of seriousness that can grip you.
The subject
but like
matter is serious, isn't it? In that case,
Yeah.
his wife's just run off with the other guy from the circus or whatever it is.
Yeah, and like it's like you can empathize with this character, and he's about to go like kill people. Like it's not like things are not going well for this guy, and the lyrics are supporting that. But there is a great deal of opera where the lyrics, like it sounds very beautiful, and you're like, wow, what just amazing stuff. And the actual lyrics are like, he is so happy, I am so happy, 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 and it's in Italian, so therefore it must be artsy.
Yeah.
But the Italians listening to this are like, all right, here's the stupid song about happiness.
Yeah.
And so I think on that level, like translation allows people to understand opera for what it is, but much is lost. Like in every translation, much is lost. And
Sure.
so that's always going to be there. But on the other side, the audience does gain something by being able to actually see it for what it is, instead of sort of revering something that's it's foreign, so it must be, super intelligent.
Yeah. So in total, then, how many different languages have you sung opera in? What's
I
your
mean, opera
experience?
specifically, I think would be 4. I've done some art song in Czech, and I believe we've done some Hebrew art song. I mean, like art song will expand to a greater degree, but operas I've done 4 languages: Russian. I mean, 5, I guess, with English. So English, Russian, Italian, French, German.
Okay, and from all of that, is there anything about Italian that was unique? I mean, apart from
Italian
the language aspect, obviously, but
Italian has a clarity of vowel that is special. I mean, there's a reason why Italian opera. I mean, I guess there's a historical reason why Italian opera is sort of revered, is that it's the beginning, in some sense. Like opera sort of came out of that region and in that language. But I would say Italian does have. Stylistically, the Italians fit into a certain idea that works very, very well with the human voice. And the language supports that well, in the sense that it allows you to have a very clear flowing line in a language that is mostly vowel.
right.
And then when it's interrupted by consonants, the whole concept of single and double consonants in Italian gives the language... it just gives the language a rhythm that you don't get to find in a lot of other languages. And there's a musicality to Italian in terms of the rhythm of that language that I think is well suited for song. That said, I think you could say that about any language. I think that you can find musicality in any of those languages and a unique flavor to each of those languages. But for something where your goal is, I want to stand here and 50 to 100 feet away, there's a crowd of 4,000 people, and they all need to hear exactly what I'm doing above this other crowd of 50 really loud instruments. Like, for that particular setting, which is a very, artificial setting, that ends up being a nice fit for Italian.
Yeah, I can imagine how the sort of sonoric qualities of Italian being more kind of direct and clear than, say, French, for example, would make it much more suited to that kind of environment. Like, I can see that. Although, of course, there's lots of wonderful French opera as well.
There is, yeah.
Okay, so let's move on to this crazy idea that I have of potentially learning Italian via opera. Because the background is that in terms of language learning, I'm becoming more and more interested in input-based methods. So I'm just using a lot of input rather than what how I used to approach things, which was basically try and, work on my speaking a lot. And so the magic crossover, as I see it, is between learning a language with lots and lots of input, in combination with content that you really, really like. That's the kind of magic thing, right? If you spend all your time listening and reading to stuff that you really like, what can go wrong?
Sure.
So I really have no idea whether or not something like opera, because like when I think about Italian, right, the major thing that I like is opera and Italian song in general. There's nothing else Italian that particularly kind of jumps out at me and says, "Oh, I love that." It's just opera is kind of
the food.
Well, the food, yeah, but I mean, language related. Of course, the food and the country. I mean, I've been to Italy many times and stuff. But in terms of like obvious content types, like that's where my mind goes to. So I've got a few different questions. But what's your like immediate reaction to using opera or Italian song as a basis for learning Italian? Like, what are the main things that cross your mind at that point?
So opera Italian is a different language than spoken Italian. And that is not a problem if that is your goal. One of the nice things about being able to be, in some sense, fluent in opera is that you can go to operas and the vocabulary is going to be reused from show to show. I did this before I wrote my book. I was writing my book came from a master's thesis that I wrote when I was in music school. Okay. And it was specifically, I wrote the book in some sense, like the terrible version of the book. My master thesis is awful, just to put it out there. Like, I tried to turn something like that into my editor, and he was like, "If you do this, I will cancel your contract." He hated it, but regardless, the method was in there, and the initial version of that method was specifically how should singers learn languages. Like that was actually the initial
right.
book. That
for the purposes of becoming better singers.
Yes.
Rather than learning the language as such.
I mean, it was learning the language as such. I mean, the thing I was talking about earlier in terms of this 18 songs and arias thing is that you can learn a language and you can not learn a language and sing.
Yeah.
You can learn all the words and sing, and that gets you to a certain point. And that's a valuable point. Like you are better for sure by knowing all the words individually, one by one translations. Then you can get to the point where you actually can think and speak in the language.
Yeah.
And each of those levels is vastly different in terms of what you can convey to an audience.
Yeah. In terms of emotion and articulation.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's not about like pronunciation is one thing, but you can nail pronunciation with 18 songs and 18 Italian songs and arias level. Like you can completely sound perfect, and it will not sound perfect because you have no idea what you're talking about.
Yes.
You are just making sounds, and those sounds could be exactly right, and they're still completely wrong.
Oh, so that might be an interesting avenue just to get started. I mean, although Italian pronunciation, I guess, is fairly familiar to me in the sense that, I mean, I've heard a lot of it over the years, and it's not too dissimilar from Spanish, obviously. You mentioned, okay, so you said that Italian from opera is different from spoken Italian. Say a little bit more about that.
Yes, yeah. So, like at the same time as I was writing this master's thesis on learning for singers. I also had this idea of what happens if we look at frequency lists for opera, and what happens if we specifically just take all of the vocabulary that is used in every libretto that I could find.
Okay, that's what you emailed me a few weeks ago.
Yes, I emailed you a chunk of this thing. So one of the nice things about Italian opera is that it's all open source at this point. There's no more copyright.
Yeah.
And so you can basically find the top 50 Italian operas and literally every word of all of those operas, and you can load them into a frequency list generator.
Yep.
And there used to be a really great tool for this, and that tool died recently. And like actually, some people in my Facebook group are starting to recreate this thing, which is good because we need it. But basically, I took all of the libretti, I stuck them together in this giant Word file, and then I dumped them into a frequency list generator, and then I subtracted out the top 1,000 words in Italian.
What do you mean you subtracted out the top 1,000 words in Italian?
Actually, looking at it here, maybe I didn't. I was going to. I feel like I have a version without it. I like in every language, like in English, the top word is the. Like 25% of the whole English language is the word the.
Yeah.
And the fact that, the word "the" was used a lot in English opera is uninteresting. Like, well, of course it is. It's English.
Yeah.
But what are the words that are like especially operatic? What are the words that if you knew the top 1,000 and then you also knew the top 200 of these, then you would basically know 90% of everything you ever heard in opera?
Okay.
Like, could we make that list? And so I started toying with this idea of creating a frequency list that was specifically opera-based, that was basically just the top, let's say, 1,000 words in opera with examples from libretti and translated examples from libretti.
Okay.
So that you could find any word in order of frequency and then find 2 or 3 examples from operas and then stick them into your flashcards or whatever your learning system you were going to do and learn it that way. And I was like, this is super exciting. Like, this will be great for singers. And I started that project and then just kind of abandoned it when the book started happening. But as it turns out, like, there is not a lot of variation. Like, there's just not. Operas tend to be about like power and love and the heart and swords and dying. And once you get through all of the swords and dying and art and love and all this, there's not much more that they talk about. They don't go off and like discuss watermelons in the middle of an opera.
Yeah. So when you say it's different, Italian from opera is different from spoken Italian, are you referring to kind of just vocabulary type, or is there more here? Like, because I mean, I was looking at this book which you recommended me, which I don't know if people can see here, the Grammar and Translation for the Italian Libretto, everybody's bedtime reading, and one of the things that it points out here on the blurb at the back is about the archaic forms and poetic syntax.
Yes.
So how does that figure into what you were saying? I mean, I guess what I'm asking here is, if I study Italian opera, am I going to be learning old Italian that no one uses anymore? Or is that an oversimplification?
Yes and no.
Yes and no.
You will be learning literary Italian.
Literary Italian, okay.
And old literary Italian. You'll be learning things like the passato remoto, which is like never used except in weird art history books and things like that. I think is my understanding. I've never seen it. I mean, I think it'll show up in like newspapers and stuff. But it's the sort of thing you say, in 1634, this building was erected, and like it's how you would use the word erected in that particular context.
Yeah.
I have a friend named David, who's one of my coaches in USC, and he primarily learned Italian for the purposes of opera, and learned it very, very well, to the point where he could speak it comfortably.
Yeah.
And he went to Italy, and spoke. He recounted to me a few stories of going to Italy, talking to people, and them just not taking him down, but just being like, what is wrong with you? Like,
no, I can totally understand how that might happen.
Yeah, I mean, there was this sense of like, he was basically saying, no, I'm not. I think he was getting into arguments as to whether he was a native speaker and B just screwing with them on purpose.
He wasn't challenging people to duels and stuff like that, was he?
I mean, he wasn't, but he was using things like the passato remoto, and it's like, it's just not used. Okay. You don't you don't say like, hey, you would say, hey, do you want a burger? Not like, hast thou given me mine burger? Like, it's just.
Yeah. I mean, you got similar. I mean, I remember having similar issues with in Egypt with modern standard Arabic, which everybody learns, right? But nobody actually speaks, and so if you actually speak to people in modern standard Arabic, they often have a bit of a chuckle before they really understand. But it's quite humorous. All right, so I guess there's this I guess fairly big issue of the actual nature of the language. So I guess the question then would be, well, if you use this as a source of learning Italian, all right, it's not necessarily what you'll end up speaking, but is it a good way into the language, particularly if you're very motivated by the subject matter? And I mean, I guess that, I mean, you correct me if I'm wrong here, but I would imagine that quite a lot of the grammar that you would learn, I mean, the kind of fundamental structural grammar of the language would be pretty much the same, even if you take a sort of early Rossini or Donizetti opera or something like that, which is a few hundred years old, but I guess that the main structure would still be there. It would allow you to get a handle on the language. What do you think?
I think absolutely. I mean, I think that going into a language with content that you're interested in is I would say never. I think I can say never a bad choice. I
I
mean,
mean, there are
you're
extremes though on that scale, aren't there? I mean, you wouldn't send someone in to study Shakespeare if they were learning English, right?
I mean, if
But I
they
guess
were that
their aim
interested
is
in it,
that. Yeah.
I mean,
Okay.
if they were completely fascinated by Shakespeare and they
Yeah.
were like, this is the pinnacle of what English can do,
Yeah.
and I just want to memorize literally everything that Shakespeare's ever written, and not just memorize it, but like know it in my soul, and then I want to go to America and order hamburgers, like there's going to be a learning curve there when they hit America, with and just realize that the dialect they've learned is not the dialect that people speak.
Yeah.
But they know a dialect of English, and it's an interesting dialect of English, and they learned it so much faster because they were interested.
Right. And I guess the foundation there, I mean, if you are learning from a source which is, very, I don't know, what would you call it? I mean, a kind of very erudite source, whether it's kind of literature or poetry or opera. I mean, you're not going to be learning crap, are you? You're going to be learning, good stuff, albeit quite old. So,
Yes,
that's
I
a good
mean, but
thing.
like, what is crap? Like, basically, we're just talking like content. From my standpoint, content's content, and it's content in a particular dialect or not. This is opera dialect. You're talking about potentially, ordering hamburgers dialect versus Shakespeare dialect versus whatever. Like, those are all different languages slightly, but they're all related to each other.
Sure.
And if you're interested in them, that's it's too big of an advantage to ignore.
Yeah, it's the unfair advantage, isn't it, of starting a language if that's the thing that you're so into. I mean, I guess my aim here is ultimately to speak. I mean, and fairly early on as well. I mean, my main reason for learning Italian at this point is because I live in London, and literally every single time I go into a cafe or a restaurant, the person serving me is Italian. I mean,
Cool.
that's the way London is.
Yeah.
And it's not just cafes and restaurants. I meet cool Italian people everywhere I go. The last few times I've had video work done, or someone's I don't know, the guy who did some of the graphics of my new website. In fact, the developer who actually coded up my website is Italian. I meet Italians everywhere, and they're such wonderful people, and I love
Yes.
I love hanging out and interacting with Italians, and I meet them on a daily basis in London. So my sort of primal motivation here is to kind of unlock the language so that I can speak with people and communicate. So it seems to me that I've got a balancing act here between actually generating that passion and desire to learn through the content that I like, whilst also not ignoring the practical side of actually learning the language.
And I think you can have both. I don't see a conflict there. I mean, I do see the fact that there will be a challenge that you have to go through when you're adapting, the language that you've been learning to the language that is going to be spoken by the people around you.
Yeah.
But you're going to have to deal with that anyway. Honestly, there's always going to be a learning curve when you make that jump.
Sure, it's not like the language from your beginner's textbook is how people speak on the street, is it? So
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, you're going to be made fun of slightly anyway.
Yeah.
It's fine.
Okay,
that's part of this
great.
process.
What about how does Italian popular song fit into this? Now, I know this might not be in your area, in your sort of area of expertise, but I mean, in addition to I mean, so my favorite the kind of opera, Italian opera that I like the most it's the kind of Puccini, Leoncavallo, and this kind of turn of the century. I don't know how you'd classify that. Is that
Romantic.
late romantic?
Late romantic.
Pretty
phase, yeah.
late romantic. I mean, La Boheme obviously is like massively romantic. That's what I really like. But I also really like kind of 20th century Italian song.
Yeah.
The kind of stuff that Andrea Bocelli might record. Like totally over the top, overblown, romantic, like all this stuff. But I love
awesome
it.
stuff. That's
So
great
like,
stuff.
how are you familiar with the language from that, and how that? I mean, is that more? Is it less archaic than some of the opera stuff we've been talking about?
I believe so. I mean, I've sung some of it, and my impressions so far have been that, yeah, it is less archaic. I mean, the vocab overlaps a fair bit in the sense that it's still all about, hearts and love and all that.
And, yeah.
Yeah, so like on that part, we've been singing about the same stuff for hundreds of years, so it's, you generally don't, again, sing about watermelons. So Yeah, I mean, there's some overlap, but yes, I would say it's less archaic.
All right. All right. So I guess the last question I've got here, I've got a few notes here, and we've kind of gone through this quite nicely. But the other thing that I was wondering about is just a kind of practical question in terms of, or let's say that I wanted to study with La Boheme, for example.
Yeah.
And you sit down and you find, I mean, hopefully, it's open source. How long is copyright? Is it 70 years?
I believe there's one of Puccini's operas that is was still in copyright or is still in copyright, and I think it's
Tosca maybe was earlier, wasn't
Tosca.
it? I think.
No. Which is the with Liu? The one that's sort of like all Asian influenced. That one.
Madame Butterfly?
Yes, I think you're right about Tosca. No, I was for a second thinking Madame Butterfly, but I don't believe that is in copyright. There is a book actually that is you may probably want to get. Maybe, I don't know. There's a book that basically all singers. It's like the Singer Bible for opera.
Okay.
They are by Nico Castel, who passed away a few years ago. He was the diction coach at the Met.
Okay.
And it has libretti, usually 5 per book. They're these thick books that are like they're huge. They're just giant, thick books.
What's the series name?
If you look Nico Castel opera libretti, you'll find it.
Okay, cool. I'll put that in the notes here for people.
For a second. And so Nico Castel's opera libretti are basically these giant tomes where you'll have 5 libretti. You'll have every line of every single person, and there'll be 3 lines or 4 per row on your sheet. The first line will be Italian, but with spaces between each word. The second line will be the English translation of each word one by one.
Wow. Okay.
Or each phrase one by one in this particular context. The next line will be IPA, like perfect, exact pronunciation of every single word in this particular context. So if the word, if one word is influenced by the next word and it's elided together, then that will be in there as well. And then the final line will be if it's not obvious from the word-for-word translation what is being intended by this particular sentence, then there'll be another English translation of that whole line. And then there may also be a footnote saying, hey, when he refers to horns, that refers to this particular cultural reference of whatever. And so they're just brilliant, amazing books. They're expensive, but they're amazing. And the reason why this copyright thing's coming to mind is because Nico never actually got to do the final Puccini opera because of copyright.
Because he was still in copyright. Okay. Yeah. Oh, that sounds fascinating. So, so what I was going to ask was, if you actually took one of these operas, let's take La Boheme as an example, because it's my favorite, and you actually got to lay out the text in a document or whatever. Like, how much content have you actually got there? Like, what would we be talking about in terms of actual word count or like pages of text?
I mean, it's not a ton.
It's not. I mean, that's sort of what was on my mind. It's like how much material are you actually going to have there? Because obviously, it's so slow, isn't it, when it's sung that I'd never actually considered, the extent of the material and how much there is there to kind of sink your teeth into.
Well, I mean, operas like Puccini's stuff tend to be a little bit more text than you would get with something like Mozart or anyone super early who's writing in Italian. Many of the sort of early stuff has a lot more repetition than something like Puccini. Puccini tends to have stories with content, and so you will get more there. I'm looking at my giant corpus of all libretti together, and it's looking like it's around 200,000 words for the whole thing of every single opera ever. But that's not a useful chunk of information for you. So I'm trying to.
But I mean, it's not that much though. I think
it's not a ton.
Words. I mean, a book. My books of short stories are 30,000 words. So that's only 6 or 7 books. It's not that much.
It's not a ton. No. And I mean, again, the vocabulary is sort of duplicated over and over and over again. So it's like once you've learned one opera, you've learned a good chunk of all operas.
Yeah.
One of the things I'm sort of noticing in this frequency list, for instance, normally when you have the top 1,000 words in a language, then you should have around a 75 or 80% comprehension rate with that particular set of text. In opera, if you're at the 1,000 mark, you have 90% comprehension.
Okay.
It's just they just don't. It's not a rich source of content in terms of the words.
Yeah, I think that's the message that I'm getting from this chat. Really, that I think it seems that the best way to go about this is to use the opera itself as, given that I like it so much, as my kind of big motivating, the kind of the shining light,
Yeah.
and to kind of use learn the language that's there for the sake of learning to understand what I'm listening to. I just hope that when I understand what I'm listening to, it doesn't spoil the whole effect. But I guess
I don't think it does. No, I don't think it will. No, I mean, I find that being able to understand what you're hearing adds to it. I think consistently. I mean, even when it's silly, and you're just like, this is stupid. Like these are dumb lyrics.
Yeah.
That adds something too. Honestly, like maybe it takes away from the glamour of it on some level, but also it allows you to appreciate the humor of it. I mean, this is what Italians are noticing when they listen to something, and they're like, okay, this is corny, but it's really good music.
It gets
so
you
great.
closer to the truth in any event, doesn't it?
Yes. And I think that is always more interesting.
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah, I agree. All right, Gabe, listen, this has been really, really fascinating. Thanks so much for taking the time. For those who don't know you, sorry we didn't do a long introduction at the beginning here, but
No worries. Yeah.
the book is Fluent Forever.
Yes.
The app is Fluent Forever. Tell us about the app.
Is.
Can we pre-order at the moment? Is it still open?
It is still open.
It's open.
It is open at least until August 1st. And then August 30th is our current planned release. Right now we're on target. We're going to have our first beta at the end of May, which is like just about to happen. It's about to go in my hands in a week or two. Yeah, it's nuts. Yeah. So this thing's happening. It's pretty exciting. It's looking really, really good.
Well, for those people who are listening far into the future, then, because I actually looked the other day, and our last conversation has the second highest watch time on my entire YouTube channel.
Sweet.
Hopefully this one's a bit more obscure, so I don't know.
It's pretty obscure, but we'll see.
I don't know if people are going to be watching this till the end or not. But anyway, for those people watching in the future, I guess they can just go to the App Store, right? And
yes, once we're past August, it'll be in the App Store.
Wonderful. All right then. Well, listen, man, I really appreciate it, and talk soon.
Me too. Great.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.